This arrangement is important. The same arrangement that you see in the cartilage is the same arrangement that we see in bone. The fibers that you see in the cartilage and the bone are the same fibers that we see in the tendons and ligaments that are doing all the connecting. Okay? All right. So on the end of this bone, I've got what kind of cartilage? Articular, which is hyaline cartilage, which has a perichondrium that helps attach it and connect it to the bone, because the bone has fibers, and the underlying hyaline cartilage has collagen fibers in it, right? And those fibers go into the collagen that makes up the bone. Are we all right?
How does the periosteum work in which the
Well, we're going to start. We're just starting. Are we okay? So what happens then is when we take a look at bone, what we're looking at is calcium carbonate and calcium phosphate. They're called molecular or formula units. They're basically molecules out there because they're ions. Are we okay? All right. It's dominated by calcium phosphate. And so we have all these mineral salts, and then because it's connective tissue, we also have to have fibers. So what we have is these mineral salts and these fibers, and fiber is collagen, and they have just the right mixture. So what it does for us is it creates a matrix that's really, really firm and solid, but it's a matrix that will also bend. And so what will happen is if we take a look at bone, it actually has the ability to withstand changes in shape, torsion, and twisting, and that kind of stuff, until the point that you've overtaxed it, and then it breaks. So if you jump up and down like you're jumping rope, what will happen is you land on the bones of your leg, and all the way down through your feet. All of those bones are doing like this a little bit. They're kind of moving. And every time you go into the gym and you lift weights, we're pulling on those bones, and we're pulling on the fibers of those bones. Are you with me so far? So the periosteum then, the periosteum then, when we take a look at it, has fibers that if I'm attaching a muscle to a bone, it's connected by what's it's density connective tissue, but what do we call it? If it goes muscle to bone. Tendon. If it goes bone to bone? Ligament. Ligament. Good. So if I'm attaching a muscle to a bone and I'm lifting weights, what's happening is the collagen fiber in the bone itself goes into the perichondrium and becomes part of the fibrous layer, and then goes into the tendon and goes all the way up through the tendon to the fascia and the connective tissue that covers and makes up the muscle itself, making a continuous connection between all of those guys. Not layers attached to a layer attached to a layer, but a continuous network of fibers through all of those tissues that's common to every tissue. Am I making sense? And as we do more of the bone and muscle and stuff, we'll kind of be putting more and more of this together. So what we're really creating then between the cartilage, the bones, the tendons, the ligaments, and the muscles is this continuous network of collagen fibers connecting them all. So if you were going to be a forensic anthropologist and you found this pile of bones out in the desert and you work for it's your CSI, wherever you want to be. And so I wouldn't suggest Las Vegas because it's really, really hot in the summertime and the wind blows a lot. I grew up not far from there, so about 150 miles not far. So anyway, pick someplace nice. CSI, Honolulu. And so you find this pile of bones and you're looking at it, and one of the ways that you'll tell whether it's a male or a female will be when you look at where the muscles attach to bones, like the deltoid tuberosity, you'll look at how big it is. And what will happen for males, they have more muscle mass by average that will be bigger in a male than it would be in a female. And if it was a male and it was really, really big, then you would say the guy was really Muscular, yeah. And so now you're starting to figure out what the guy's body shape was and all that kind of stuff. Does that make sense? And because the more stress you place on this bone when that tendon is pulling on it, the more the bone goes, wow, this guy's really putting a lot of stress on us. We need to respond or else we might break. And so it makes bigger attachments for the muscles because the muscles are getting stronger. Okay? So when we take a look, this is spongy bone in this case. And so we find spongy bone, like I said, on the ends of the bones. We find some flat bones that have spongy bone. And then in the medullary cavity, for a small portion of that, we find spongy bone that lines that cavity also. And now, can you see why it was called spongy bone? Now, these little guys right here, ultravenculate. We'll talk about their structure later. But they have all of these holes under here. So when you look at this, and remember, when the guys were looking at this originally, that was a long time ago when they actually probably used natural sponges, which have a lot more holes than the synthetic ones that you buy, at the store. And so it really looks like that unnatural sponge, so it's spongy bone. And this is just a comparison between cartilage and bone, and you can take a look at this in your textbook. But a couple things to kind of point out. The structure of these two guys, two different molecules that make them up. Both have fibers. The fibers are going to vary here. Vascularity, none, and extensive vascularization. So that means this guy repairs well, this guy does not repair well at all. And strength, it says limited bend easily, but it's hard to break. And this says resist distortion until the breaking point. When we get to the bones, we'll actually have some in the lab where we play with them, where we've taken out most of the organic material and left the minerals behind. Another bone where we left the minerals, took the minerals out and left the organic stuff behind. And one is so brittle if you barely bend it, it snaps. And the other one, you can grab it and it's like it's made out of rubber. So the two have to work together to give you both of those characteristics of the bone. So this is muscle tissue. So you have three kinds: skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle. When we get going this term a little bit further, we have an entire chapter that just deals with muscle tissue. So we're not going to go into hardly any physiology of these guys because we're going to do that really, really thoroughly later. So just a few things that we need to take care of with these muscles is the one you see on top, that's going to be called skeletal muscle. It is considered striated because it has these lines in it. And these lines are created because of the arrangements of the proteins, actin and myosin, and how they overlap each other. So sometimes people want to call this, when they name it, striated muscle. You can't do that. You have to call it skeletal muscle because the cardiac muscle also has striations. So it is a striated muscle also, and they're not the same thing. So this is skeletal muscle tissue. When we take a look at this guy, the job is to transfer forces. So we see the cells typically all running in one direction. Now, within a particular muscle, they might run in different directions, but that means they're running in different directions to a tendon that makes up the larger muscle. Does that make sense? But so all the guys are running in the same direction, transfer force in the same direction. So they'll all line up with each other. Nice, orderly little rows of cells, because they all have to contract and relax in the same direction. They're going to be striated because of the proteins that are present, and they're also going to be what we call multinucleated. Now, the reason that they're multinucleated is twofold. One, when we start growing muscles, we just don't grow a muscle. What we do is we grow muscle cells. And then the muscle cells fuse together, and they make little parts of a muscle, or what we might call small muscles, who then all come together to make a much bigger muscle. And so that's what's happening embryonically. And so by the time you get a big muscle, you had a lot of cells that are fused together, and then we end up with these cells that have multiple nuclei that are in them. The other reason you need all the nuclei is the skeletal muscles are just going to be packed with protein fibers, the actin and the myosin, and then all of the enzymes you need to make these guys do their job. Now, if you remember back in 2011 when they did protein synthesis, I have like 6 people going like this. Transcription and translation. And he thought you'd never use that in A&P. So that process, the nucleus is, the DNA in the nucleus is read, right? So we transcribe a RNA, messenger RNA copy that goes out into the cell. That goes out to the ribosomes where we translate that, correct? And decide what protein we're going to make. Are you with me? Okay. If you're chock full of proteins, and you're a really long cell, and you've only got one nucleus, the odds are you will never be able to send out enough messenger RNA to make all the proteins that you need, and that cell will die. So you have multiple nuclei, all busy, sending out the message, make more protein, make more protein, make more protein, make more protein. Does that make sense? That's the other reason you have to have all of these nuclei that are present. And then these guys are voluntary. That means you control them. So if you take your finger and do this, okay? So now do this. Now stop. Now do this. Now stop. Now do this. Now stop. Okay? So could you tell your finger to move? Could you tell your finger to stop moving? So these are under conscious voluntary control. Don't get that confused with the idea that you can't have reflexes that you never thought about. Reflexes are pre-programmed pathways that are going to have the same response to the same stimulus that protects you. So if you poke yourself with a needle, rather than it go into the finger, you look at it, go, I think that's going into my finger, and have it go out the other side before you figure out that, ooh, I should have moved my finger. And the minute it goes in, a reflex causes your arm to go this way, even though you didn't think about it. But voluntary means that you can do this. Does that make sense? Okay. So, multinucleated, striated, and voluntary. And obviously, if they're skeletal muscles, then they must make up your muscles. Okay. And so cardiac tissue is only found in the heart. What do we notice with these guys in terms of the lines? They are striated. These guys are much smaller cells. And so we see the edge of the cell here, the edge of the cell here, one here, one here, one here. And so these guys are mononucleated. So they're not multinucleated because they're much smaller. Although they're still full of protein like crazy. And then these guys, when we take a look at them, in terms of their control, these guys are involuntary. So you can't tell your heart what to do. It's going to do what it does. Does that make sense? Okay? All right? And when we take a look at these guys, one of the things that makes them unique, and then they show it nicely on this diagram, you can see it over here too, where these guys are coming together, is they actually branch, so they interconnect with each other. This is just one cell, and he just goes from end to end. He doesn't connect with this cell. These guys, this is one cell, and he's connecting here, it's connecting here, and this guy's connecting here, connecting with this cell, and so we have all this branching that goes on. Where they connect, this is a special structure called an intercalated disc, and where you have an intercalated disc, you have a gap junction. So remember, gap junctions are where the two membranes come together, and we actually have basically a hole between the cells where they communicate. Cytoplasmic control from one cell to the next. What that allows is the message that we need to have for a cell to be told to contract is called an action potential. What we can do with cardiac muscle cells is very quickly, because of the intercalated disc, move the action potentials from one cell to the next. So that means when we tell your heart to contract, it means all the cells sort of get the message at basically the same time, so they can all contract at the same time. We get a more efficient heart contraction, that's why a muscle contraction.
Did you say intercalated discs are the same thing as gap junctions?
When we see an intercalated disc, that's where they're coming together, and intercalated discs are made up of gap junctions. And we'll talk about this a lot more this term and then a whole bunch next year. Does that make sense? Are we okay? All right, so mononucleated, striated, and involuntary. Now this is smooth muscle, and it's smooth muscle because it has no striations, and so that's simply why it was called smooth. Mononucleated, if it's not a heart and it's an organ in your body, then it's good, except for skeletal muscle, then it's going to be made up of smooth muscle. The walls of blood vessels, the muscle that makes up part of your liver, the muscle that would be found around your intestines and your esophagus. All of those guys are glandular tissue. All of those are going to be smooth muscle. One of the characteristics of this guy is he has a peculiar shape, and that he tapers on each end and then he widens in the middle. And so that's called a spindle shape. And what that does, it allows these guys really nicely to fit together so we can make sheets of these guys. And we can run these sheets in different directions, and then that allows us to have really good control in terms of contraction. And so like with your stomach, you have 3 different layers of smooth muscle running in 3 different directions. So we want to push on one part to move some food around, get it mixed a little better. We have amazing control. So if you get a video and you can watch a stomach in action, I think our image is just goes squish, squish, squish. No, it's it ties itself in knots. And when you see really cool pictures, most of the time your stomach, they show you it's kind of shaped like a comma. It's got that kind of pear shape. And get a picture of stomachs in action, and you'll see like sometimes 5, 6, 7 separate bulges and narrow parts in between where it's just going like this and really going crazy. And so that's what this shape allows us to do. A lot of flexibility in being able to move in different directions that way. So this guy is non-striated, involuntary, and mononucleated, and found in every organ of the body except for skeletal muscle and the cardiac muscle. And so this is just pictures of these guys, a little different from the ones in your book. You can see the skeletal muscle, nice little long cells with all the little nuclei that are present. Notice we have striations that are here. When we take a look at smooth muscle, we can see nice thin spindle-shaped cells that are present here. And then this is our cardiac muscle where we can see our intercalated discs. Notice these guys are real stringy. They kind of go all over the place. Not those guys. This last guy we have here, this is nervous tissue. Chapter 12 is dedicated to this guy, so we're not going to spend a huge amount of time on him right now. Basically, when we take a look at neural tissue and nervous tissue, there's really 2 broad categories. One of the categories are neurons, and those are the guys that send messages. Now, these guys right here are called neuroglia, or neural glial cells, or just glial cells. And their job is basically to be all the help that these guys need. So they organize, they protect, they help to nourish, they insulate. They have tons of different jobs. I shouldn't say tons. They have numerous different jobs. And we'll take a look at the different players we have when we get to chapter 12. Right now, we just need to know we have this group of guys, and they have these kind of special roles. When we see a typical neuron, and they're going to have about 5 different basic shapes, or 4 different basic shapes that we'll talk about. One of the things we typically see is it's got this larger portion that we call the body, or the soma, and that's where the nucleus is located, and most of the cellular machinery is here. And then they have a tendency to have extensions that are sticking off of them. So the guy that they're showing me here, this is called a multipolar neuron. And he's kind of really popular in the body. We see a lot of neurons that are multipolar neurons. And he's the easiest one to talk about in terms of the extensions that he has. And so when you have a multipolar neuron, like we said, cell body or soma that's here, we have this long extension that comes out, and then multiple extensions here that are coming off and branching off of the soma. So these guys right here are called dendrites, and this guy's called an axon. You can't always tell dendrites from axons in terms of their shape. So how we really describe these guys is, if it's a dendrite, he's always carrying information towards the soma. If it's an axon, it's always carrying information away from the soma to some other structure. Does that make sense to everybody? And that's kind of all we need to know about this guy. These parts right here are called axonal terminals or axonal knobs. That's really all we need to know about him for right now. Like I said, chapter 12 will kind of wear you out talking about neurons. Okay. So these are our membranes. So the top one's a mucous membrane. So it must produce mucus. What's the unicellular exocrine gland that we might see associated with this guy? Goblet cell. Okay, is there a multicellular gland that might be associated with this guy? There's one in particular that's called a mucus gland, which produces mucus. Good. So when we talk about the mucous membrane, it's obvious the membrane that's going to produce mucus. And so sometimes the goblet cells will be producing mucus, and that might be okay. But most of the time what we'll see is down in here, we'll see a larger gland that'll have a little duct that's coming up, and he's also going to produce mucus. So they're just called mucus glands, and we see them like in digestive tract and places like that. Are we okay? Right. And the job is simply, like we said, to produce mucus. So the purpose for having mucus is typically going to be protection from friction or protection from gunk getting where we don't want it to be. So in your respiratory system, remember our escalator that we talked about is going to move the mucus upward through your trachea and up to your esophagus where you swallow it. And the digestive tract will produce mucus like crazy to help everything slide. In your stomach and in the small intestine also, we have a lot of digestive enzymes and things, and acid in the stomach. We produce mucus so that you won't eat yourself up. If you didn't produce enough mucus, then those enzymes would come in contact with the cells to make up your GI tract, and then it would just break down your cells. And so if it happens in a minor sort of way, we call that a little bit of an ulcer or maybe gastritis. If it happens in a major sort of way, sometimes we just call it dead. One of the reasons is if you get a perforating ulcer in the wrong spot, then the gastric juices flood out of the stomach, and your aorta goes right down through here. So there was a guy a few years ago that read a book about reducing stress, and the reason he wrote the book is he had this really high stress job, and it affected his digestion, and his hair was falling out, and all this kind of stuff. And he knew that he was having stomach problems, and he had a lot of pain. He was walking down the street, and he collapsed, and his perforating ulcer had let go, and then the acid dumped out onto his aorta, and it started leaking his aorta. That's why he collapsed, because his blood pressure dropped. And they rushed him to the hospital, and they actually saved him. But after that, he decided he needed to change his lifestyle, and he wrote this book about reducing stress after he had done all these changes. So, kind of interesting. Don't mess around with ulcers. This guy right here is a serous membrane. We've already talked about these guys a little bit. They produce a watery sort of fluid. The peritoneum, the pericardium, the pleural membranes, all of those guys are going to be that serous membrane. And the material that they produce, the molecule, is just called transudate. The cutaneous membrane, that is just your
Skin.
Here's your skin. Yeah, so it's your skin out here, and any place that's connected to your skin. So right in here is still a little bit of cutaneous right there. And so we'll talk about this guy in chapter 5 a lot. So I'm just going to leave that guy for right now. And then the last one you have is the synovial membrane. Synovial membranes actually are going to be membranes that are going to, these guys are typically sort of broad, that are going to surround joints. And so the joint that has a synovial membrane is called a synovial joint, the most common joint in your body. And so what will happen is we'll have this outer layer that's here that's called the capsule, and then you'll have areolar tissue and fibrous tissue that's here, and then you have a lining of epithelial cells that are present here. But one of the things that's interesting about this membrane is the cellular layer is not complete. You'll have big gaps in it where there aren't any cells at all. And that's pretty peculiar for an epithelium. And so it gets the name epithelium, but doesn't necessarily look like other epithelium. What it will do is it will create a fluid, it's called synovial fluid. And since this guy circles around the joint, 360, so it goes all the way around the knee and closing all of this, then the synovial fluid just fills up all of this space, and ergo it's called a synovial membrane. And so this is the articular cartilage between these two bones. Does that make sense? All right. And so this is the mucous membrane, and so we see our goblet cells that are here, we see the epithelial layer. What's this right here?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, what's this look like? It probably is.
Pseudostratified columnar.
Pseudo-stratified chelated columnar epithelia. Yep. And so there's our different serous membranes. We talked about these guys already. So if it's on the heart, or if it's on the lung, or if it's attached to an organ, it is a visceral membrane. It's attached to the body cavity. It's a parietal membrane. In between is a cavity full of serous fluid. Good, because it's a serous membrane. And then this is just your cutaneous membrane, your skin. We're going to talk about this in just a minute. And this is our, once again, our joint with our synovial membrane, synovial fluid. And we can see how it goes all the way around, encapsulates this thing. Now, this membrane is designed to produce fluid and enclose the joint, but it's not a particularly strong membrane. So basically, you're going to have on the outside of this ligaments and things that are actually helping to stabilize that joint. And this is fascia. So one of the things that confuses people is they think fascia is a particular kind of tissue. It's actually the name that we give to tissue that actually helps create a framework for our body and hold things together. So we classify it as either superficial, deep, or subserous, but when you look at it, as we go through it, you'll find there's a couple different kinds of tissues that make up the fascia. So where it says superficial fascia there, it says between the skin and the underlying organs, the areolar and adipose tissue, also known as the subcutaneous or the hypodermis layer. So when we do the skin, you guys have already started reading that chapter, here's the cutaneous layer, and then we have our hypodermis that's present here, and that's our superficial fascia. And so when you get down to the next part, it says deep fascia, and it says strong network that covers the tendons and ligaments and attaches muscle to bone and stuff, and it says it's made out of dense connective tissue. So when we talk about fascia, then you're not talking about a particular kind of tissue, you're talking about a tissue that has a particular role. And that role is to hold things together, connect things together. And so what this guy is doing is really helping to bind this layer together. These are ribs right here, and helps to bind it to here, where we have our superficial fascia, and then onto the underlying tissue. And so the last one you have is subserous fascia. So, fascia between the serous membrane and the deep fascia, and now we're back to areolar tissue. So here it was areolar and adipose. Here it is dense connective, and here it is areolar. Three different kind of tissue arrangements, but they're all fascia. Is everybody with me? Okay, so I'm not sure how Jen did your rat. You cut your rat open, you peeled the skin back, correct?
Mm-hmm.
When you peeled the skin back, it just fell right off. No, you had to take your probe and work at it, and there was some white stuff that you were breaking. What was that? What kind? Superficial fascia. Pretty tough stuff. And then if you took a look at the, when I do it, I have everybody to look at the little rat muscles. He's not real bulgy muscular, but one of the things you kind of notice is that typically from about here up, you can see a line going up to his shoulders, and then you can see some other muscle running in a different direction underneath. If you tried to separate where that little line is, you would be separating he doesn't have very big pecs, but his pectoralis major from his underlying abdominal muscles and some of the serratus and stuff and intercostals. And it would be really difficult to do because that fascia holds it together. So in your book, they show you these pretty pictures of muscles, and all the muscles look like individual little guys, and they're standing out. And what happens is when you cut somebody open and you want to separate those muscles, you have to dig in and separate all that fascia to get them to separate from each other. It's holding everything together. And then we're connecting all of that to the innermost part of our abdominal pelvic cavity or body cavities and thoracic cavity also. And so that what it does is it creates this gigantic wrapping around our core or even in our legs. So one of the effects that we have is everything's connected to everything else. So if you start to let your abdominal muscles go, sometimes now your back's going to hurt because everybody's connected and we're transferring forces and weight and that kind of stuff. And so that's called the serape effect. And the serape is this kind of blanket garment that you wrap real tight around you. And so that's why it was given that name, because this wraps around you. So that's part of that type of posture.
That membrane that's on it is a deep fascia.
Yeah, if you're looking at ribs, it's a good chance that you're looking at either the deep fascia or, depending on what side,
The back side, the membrane side of the ribs.
you could also be looking at some of the subserous fascia, depending on how they cut the rib and stuff. But yeah, certainly deep fascia, probably with the ribs. And then this is inflammation, so let's see, we'll take it through this really, really quick. Sometimes we don't do this really quick. So, with inflammation, this is a process that occurs if you get a cut, if you get a scrape, if you break your ankle, if you sprain your ankle, if you get infected with influenza H3N2, and so that's again doing this thing right now. All of those cause an inflammatory response. An inflammatory response is a predictable step 1, step 2, step 3 kind of response that goes on. So you have exposure to some kind of pathogen, or you just had damaged tissues. It does not have to be exposure to a pathogen. And what will happen is those cells that now have been damaged, either by the pathogen or by injury, they release chemicals that activate mast cells. And mast cells are going to be found in all kinds of areolar tissue, and they're going to release a kind of cocktail of other chemicals. And so you see some of them listed up there. So histamine and heparin and prostaglandin. So histamine is going to do things like tell your capillaries that they need to be more leaky. And heparin is going to be involved with anti-blood clotting kinds of stuff. So prostaglandins are typically local messengers that will tell muscles to kind of either relax or contract. So what will happen is you get these chemicals. This is the guy that's in charge of hay fever, or I shouldn't say in charge, but he's one of the big symptoms from hay fever. So we breathe in, pollen gets in our nose, the nasal mucosa goes through the inflammatory response, the mast cells release histamine, capillaries get real leaky, more fluid comes out of the capillaries, the mucous membranes in your nasal passages swell up gigantically, and then the other guys that are being produced are also going to cause your eyes to water because we're trying to flush all of that out. And, because of all of this going on. And so what will happen is we get increased blood flow, we get more fluid leaking out, that's going to cause swelling, our body is going to become more sensitive to the nerve endings, to when they're touched or anything like that, so that's that whole pain kind of thing. Because you have more blood flowing out, and because we want to interfere with the pathogens, the immune system kicks in, temperature goes up, delivering more oxygen and nutrients. The phagocytes and all the other guys that can help you to get rid of debris and to get rid of the pathogens, they're going to move in. We'll talk about next term how that happens. And then eventually, because you have all this extra blood flow, we'll have the toxins leave. The new guys, besides the guys that are going to destroy stuff, will also move in, and they'll start to rebuild the tissue. Let's say you sprain your ankle or you cut your finger, and they start to put all that tissue back together again. And then after a period of healing, you're back to normal, and you can fall down and do it all over again. And that's the whole inflammatory response, kind of in a nutshell. So when you have inflammation, the key signs will be what color?
Red.
What about the temperature? Hot. Anything else? Swelling and usually pain is the other one. And so sometimes if it's a sprained ankle, then all you do is rice, rest ice compression and elevation, and kind of helps mitigate some of that. All right. May not want to mitigate it too much, because then you interfere with the healing process. It's a tough balance. And we'll talk about that when we get to the immune system. So what's that tissue?
Simple
Simple
cuboidal.
cuboidal, renal place.
Kidney tubules.
Kidney tubules, that's great. Name the tissue.
Squamous. Simple squamous.
Simple
Squamous of the
squamous. Location?
That's in the kidney.
Kidney? Nephrons of the kidney?
Lungs.
Alveoli of the lungs?
Yeah.
Those are two good places. Name the tissue?
Skeletal muscle.
Skeletal muscle, location.
Skeletal muscles connecting bones.
Biceps, that's a good one. Okay. Voluntary, involuntary.
Voluntary. Dense.
It's the finger one. Once it's stick together like this.
Dense connective tissue?
What?
Dense connective?
It's regular connective
Oh, I
tissue.
thought I was wrong.
What you have here, see all of these guys here? You see any nuclei?
No.
No, so how can they be cells with no nuclei? So these are collagen fibers, and these are actually aggregations of nuclei that are broken. So they're careful. What's this one?
Elastic cartilage?
Plastic fibers, name a place.
Here.
Okay, here.
Reticular.
Name a place. Liver.
Oh, yeah.
What?
Reticular.
Location for reticular tissue? Liver, spleen, lymph node? Oh, reticular tissue. Oops, wrong direction. Ooh, said that. Good job. Yeah, this is fascia. So this is dissected hand. That's here. What's that one?
Cardiac.
Very muscle, what's the structure?
The intercalated disc.
Circulated disc, and that intercalated disc represents
Gap
what kind of cell
junctions.
connection? Gap junctions. Good. Name the tissue?
Simple cuboidal. No. Or stratified. But it has cilia on it.
Okay, it's a ciliated one. Good. Tall cells or short cells, flat cells?
Columnar.
Columnar, how many layers? This is one. So this is simple,
Columnar.
ciliated, columnar epithelium. And what's that?
Goblet.
Goblet cell. What tissue is this? Be more specifically connected.
Dense.
Areolar. Good.
Oh.
And that's the end.